It's late at night. Most people are asleep, the news cycle is quiet, and the world feels still. But sometimes in those quiet hours, decisions are made that don't stay quiet for long. Legal rulings that begin in courtrooms can move quickly, shaping laws, redefining boundaries, and influencing what is considered legal or illegal for millions of people almost overnight. Now imagine waking up and hearing that a closely divided Supreme Court decision may affect how certain firearms are regulated across the country, not just in theory, but in a way that could directly impact what is lawful to own, build, or transfer. So here's the question. Do you think rapid or closely divided court rulings create necessary legal clarity, or do they increase uncertainty for responsible gun owners trying to follow the law? Share your answer in the comments. To understand what is being described as a midnight ruling involving so-called ghost guns, we need to begin with a clear and careful explanation of what the legal issue actually is. The term ghost gun is commonly used to describe privately made firearms, often assembled from kits or unfinished components that may not carry serial numbers in the same way as commercially manufactured firearms. In my legal analysis, one of the most important starting points is separating terminology from law. The phrase itself is not a formal legal category. It's a descriptive term used in public discussions. The legal questions, however, revolve around how federal law defines a firearm, how components are regulated, and what requirements apply to manufacturing, serialization, and transfer. Historically, federal gun law has been shaped by statutes such as the Gun Control Act of 1968, which established definitions and regulatory frameworks for firearms, including requirements for serial numbers and licensing for manufacturers and dealers. At the time, the law focused primarily on completed firearms, rather than individual parts or unfinished components. Over time, technology and manufacturing methods evolved. The availability of kits and partially completed receivers raised new legal questions about where the line should be drawn between a regulated firearm and an unregulated component. Courts would likely examine whether existing statutory definitions adequately address these newer forms of manufacturing, or whether regulatory agencies have the authority to interpret those definitions in a broader way. This is where recent legal disputes have emerged. In my legal analysis, cases involving these issues often center on whether federal agencies, such as the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, have the authority to redefine or expand what qualifies as a firearm under existing law. On one side, there is an argument that agencies must have flexibility to address evolving technologies. On the other side, there is a strong constitutional argument that only Congress, not regulatory agencies, has the authority to create or significantly expand legal definitions. When a case reaches the Supreme Court and results in a narrow decision, such as a 5-4 ruling, it often reflects deep legal disagreement among the justices. These decisions can clarify certain aspects of the law, but they can also leave open questions that lower courts must continue to interpret. Now let's bring in the constitutional framework, because this is where the issue becomes more complex. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. However, as the Supreme Court has noted in cases like District of Columbia versus Heller, that right is not unlimited. Certain long-standing regulations have been recognized as consistent with the Constitution. More recently, in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the court emphasized that gun regulations must be evaluated based on historical tradition. This means that modern laws are often assessed by comparing them to regulations that existed at the time of the founding. There is a strong constitutional argument that any restriction on firearm ownership or manufacturing must align with this historical framework. Courts would likely examine whether regulations on unfinished components or kits have historical analogs, or whether they represent a new type of restriction that requires careful constitutional scrutiny. At the same time, the issue is not limited to the Second Amendment. The Fourth Amendment may also come into play, particularly in cases involving searches, seizures, or investigations related to firearm components. Courts would likely examine whether enforcement actions comply with constitutional protections against unreasonable searches. The Fifth Amendment can also be relevant in certain contexts, particularly regarding due process. If laws or regulations are unclear or inconsistently applied, individuals may argue that they do not provide adequate notice of what conduct is prohibited. In my legal analysis, these overlapping constitutional considerations are what make these cases especially significant. Now let's talk about federal versus state authority. Firearm regulation in the United States operates within a dual system. Federal law sets certain baseline requirements, but states also have the authority to enact their own regulations, as long as they do not conflict with constitutional protections. This means that even if a Supreme Court decision clarifies federal law, states may still have their own rules regarding manufacturing, possession, or transfer of firearms and components. For lawful gun owners, this creates a complex legal landscape. What may be permissible under federal law could still be restricted under state law. And understanding that distinction is critical for compliance. Now let's bring this into real-world impact. For individuals who build or customize firearms, the legal definitions at issue are not abstract. They directly affect what is allowed. If a component is classified as a firearm under federal law, it may be subject to serialization requirements, background check rules, and transfer regulations. In my legal analysis, one of the most significant challenges is that these definitions can change through regulatory action and court interpretation. What was previously considered an unregulated part may later fall within a regulated category. This creates potential legal risk, especially for individuals who rely on outdated information. And that risk is not just theoretical. Non-compliance with federal firearm laws can carry serious consequences. Even unintentional violations can lead to legal complications. This is why staying informed and verifying current law is essential. At the same time, supporters of stricter regulation argue that these measures are necessary to address gaps in existing law. They point to concerns about traceability and enforcement, emphasizing the importance of consistent standards. On the other hand, those who oppose expanded regulation argue that redefining components as firearms through agency action raises constitutional concerns. They emphasize that major legal changes should come from Congress, not administrative interpretation. Both perspectives are reflected in ongoing legal debates, and both influence how courts approach these cases. Looking at the political reality, changes in this area are likely to continue. Legislative proposals, regulatory updates, and court challenges all play a role. However, nationwide clarity often takes time, as different courts interpret the law and cases move through the judicial system. In my legal analysis, the long-term implications are significant. These cases are not just about specific components or definitions. They are about how the legal system adapts to new technology while remaining grounded in constitutional principles. They are about the balance between regulation and individual rights. And they are about how clearly the law communicates its requirements to the public. Because ultimately, the effectiveness of any legal system depends not just on what the law says, but on whether people can reasonably understand and follow it. So as we continue, think about this. When laws evolve in response to new technology, should the priority be flexibility for regulators or strict adherence to original definitions set by Congress? Because in the next part, we're going to go deeper into how courts analyze these disputes, what a closely divided Supreme Court decision really means in practice, and what lawful gun owners need to watch carefully moving forward. Stay with me, because the details in the next section are where legal theory turns into real-world consequences. As we move deeper into this issue, the most important thing to understand is how a closely divided Supreme Court decision actually functions in practice. A 5-4 ruling does not mean uncertainty in the legal sense. The decision is still binding. But it does signal that the court itself is sharply divided on how the law should be interpreted. And when that happens, the reasoning behind the decision becomes just as important as the outcome. In my legal analysis, courts would likely examine not only the majority opinion, but also the concurring and dissenting opinions to understand how future cases might be argued. Those dissents, while not legally controlling, often shape the next generation of legal challenges. This is especially relevant in cases involving evolving technology, where the law has not yet fully settled. When it comes to firearm components and so-called ghost gun regulations, one of the central legal questions is how far regulatory agencies can go in interpreting existing statutes. There is a strong constitutional argument that Congress must clearly define what constitutes a firearm, and that agencies cannot expand that definition beyond what the law explicitly states. This argument is often tied to broader legal principles concerning administrative authority and separation of powers. On the other hand, another perspective raised in court is that agencies must have the ability to apply existing laws to new technologies. Without that flexibility, regulations could quickly become outdated, leaving gaps that lawmakers did not anticipate. Courts would likely examine whether the agency's interpretation is consistent with the statutory language and whether it respects constitutional limits. This is not a simple yes or no question. It is a layered analysis that depends on how the law is written, how it has been applied historically, and how it interacts with constitutional protections. Now let's bring this back to the Second Amendment. In my legal analysis, one of the most significant implications of recent Supreme Court precedent is the requirement that firearm regulations align with historical tradition. That standard does not automatically resolve every modern question, especially when dealing with technologies that did not exist at the time of the founding. So courts are faced with a challenge. They must determine whether a modern regulation is analogous to historical restrictions, even if the specific technology is different. For example, if historical laws regulated the commercial sale of firearms, courts may consider whether modern regulations on firearm components serve a similar purpose. But that comparison is not always straightforward, and reasonable legal minds can disagree on how closely the analogy must match. This is why a 5-4 decision matters. It tells us that even at the highest level of the judicial system, there is no single, universally agreed interpretation of how these principles apply, and that has real-world consequences. For lawful gun owners, the immediate impact is often not a dramatic overnight change, but a shift in how laws are interpreted and enforced. Regulatory definitions may be upheld, modified, or limited. Enforcement practices may adapt, and new legal challenges may arise in response. In my legal analysis, one of the most important takeaways is that legal compliance requires staying current, not just informed in general. Because when definitions change, even slightly, the legal status of certain actions can change as well. This is particularly relevant for individuals who build, modify, or purchase firearm components. What may have been considered permissible under a previous interpretation could fall under new regulatory requirements after a court decision. And this leads directly to legal risk. Non-compliance, even if unintentional, can carry serious consequences. This is not about assuming wrongdoing. It's about recognizing that the legal system operates based on how laws are written and interpreted at the time of an action. Courts would likely examine whether an individual made a reasonable effort to comply with the law, but that does not eliminate the importance of understanding current requirements. This is why clarity matters so much. From a broader perspective, supporters of expanded regulation often argue that updating definitions is necessary to ensure that laws remain effective in a changing environment. They emphasize consistency, traceability, and the ability to enforce existing legal standards. On the other hand, those who oppose such changes argue that expanding definitions through regulatory action raises concerns about overreach. They emphasize the importance of clear legislative authority and the need to protect constitutional boundaries. Both perspectives are part of the legal conversation, and both are reflected in how courts approach these cases. Looking ahead, the political and legal reality is that this issue is far from settled. Additional cases are likely to be filed. Lower courts may interpret the ruling in different ways. Legislatures may respond with new proposals, and regulatory agencies may adjust their approach based on the outcome. In my legal analysis, the long-term direction is one of continued refinement rather than final resolution. The law will evolve. Definitions will be tested, and the balance between regulation and constitutional protection will continue to be examined. Now consider the broader implication. This is not just about one type of firearm or one category of components. It is about how the legal system adapts to change while remaining anchored in constitutional principles. It is about how clearly the law communicates its boundaries, and it is about how individuals navigate those boundaries responsibly. Because at the end of the day, the most important factor is not speculation. It is understanding. Understanding what the law actually says, understanding how it is applied, and understanding what it requires of you. So before reacting to headlines, before relying on simplified explanations, the most important step is to verify, to learn, and to stay informed. Because when it comes to the law, assumptions can create risk, but knowledge creates clarity. Now I want to leave you with one final question to think about carefully. Do you believe the legal system is adapting effectively to new firearm technologies while staying within constitutional limits? Or do you think there is still too much uncertainty in how these laws are defined and enforced? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more clear, fact-based legal analysis on issues that directly affect real-world decisions, make sure to subscribe and stay informed. Because in a system shaped by both law and interpretation, the difference between confusion and confidence often comes down to what you choose to understand.